Well, hello and welcome to another episode of In Conversation with Benedict Rogers, an interview series produced by Hong Kong Watch. And it's a really great pleasure and privilege to welcome as our guest for this episode, Michael Chong. Michael Chong is a long-standing member of Parliament from Canada and currently serves as the Canadian opposition's Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs. So, Michael Chong, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Benedict.
Thank you. Michael, I wonder if I could start by asking, I guess, a slightly personal question, which is, I understand your father was born in Hong Kong, and so I wonder if you might say a bit about your relationship with Hong Kong, and from that perspective, your reflections on the situation that Hong Kong finds itself in today.
Yes, my father was born and raised in Hong Kong. He was born in Hong Kong, which was then the Crown Colony of Hong Kong in 1929. So he grew up there as a young boy. He witnessed the fall of Hong Kong during the Battle of Hong Kong to the Japanese forces. He watched as Canadian soldiers from the Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifles of Canada bravely defend Hong Kongers from a pretty vicious assault. And so he was there for those events, and they had a profound impact on him as a young boy and later as an adult. My father eventually went to mainland China for university after the war ended. At that time, southern China was controlled by the nationalists. And as the communists headed south in the late 1940s, he fled back to Hong Kong, where he obviously was from. After a few years of, in Hong Kong, at that time, Hong Kong wasn't the bustling city it would later become. He decided to continue his university education in Winnipeg, Canada. And so he immigrated to Winnipeg in 1952, which was the start of his Canadian journey. And he always used to say to us when we were younger that when he arrived in Winnipeg, it wasn't culture shock as much as it was climate shock. He said he had never seen snow before. And then that first winter, the temperatures dropped to minus 20 degrees Celsius, and people were plugging their block heaters of their cars in so they could start, and people were wearing thick winter furs. He said he had never seen anything like that, so he wasn't fully prepared for it when the first winter came. But he later became acclimatized and eventually met my mother here at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, in Canada. And, obviously, I'm one of the 4 children that they had. When I was a youngster, my father took me to Hong Kong for the first time in 1976 as a 4-year-old to visit my grandmother. My grandfather had passed away by that point, and my other aunts and uncles and cousins. And so that was my first introduction to Hong Kong. I remember going in July of 1976. It was a hot, humid summer with lots of humidity and lots of rain. And, as a youngster from Canada, that city made an indelible impression upon me.
And your thoughts on what's happened today, in the last couple of years to Hong Kong?
Yeah, I think it's a real tragedy. Hong Kong was one of those cities where East meets West, where a blend of Chinese culture and Western culture became the norm. A city where Chinese culture blended with the rule of law, human rights, and elements of democracy. And to see what's happened to Hong Kong in the last several years is a real tragedy. It was a place where people from around the world could come and build for themselves and their families lives of hope and opportunity. And to see that being crushed by the authoritarianism of Beijing is really sad. And not to mention a violation of the 1984 Joint Declaration and international law.
Absolutely. In March last year, you were sanctioned by the Chinese regime. Why did they target you in particular, and what impact did that have on you personally?
Well, quite simply, I think they targeted me because I and others that they sanctioned were being effective. We were being effective in calling out Beijing for its gross violations of human rights and its violations of international law. But they did so in a clumsy way, not understanding that it would only further embolden us to speak out against what was going wrong, knowing that the criticism was effective. Beijing is trying to export its model of authoritarianism abroad, and one element of that authoritarianism is to shut down all dissent wherever and whenever it appears. And so it's no surprise that they targeted me, some American and European parliamentarians and elected officials for doing exactly that.
Absolutely. Looking at the current situation regarding Canada's relationship with China in particular, what would you say are the major differences between your approach to China policy and the approach of Justin Trudeau's government? And what are the areas of commonality as well?
Well, quite simply, I think our approach as conservatives is much more multilateral, much more in line with our democratic allies and partners, whether that's the United Kingdom, European Union members, or allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific region. So we would take a much more multilateral approach on many of the issues of bilateral concern between Canada and China. I'll just give you a couple examples. We believe that Canada should be part of the quadrilateral security dialogue. This is a security arrangement between Australia, Japan, India, and the United States, which exists to counter some of the threats that China is presenting to security in the Indo-Pacific region. We believe that Canada should be part of this dialogue. We believe that Canada should have been part of the AUKUS Submarinal Defense Pact, which is a recently announced defense pact between Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Again, we're unilaterally alone in not being part of this pact. On Huawei, we believe that the Trudeau government should long ago have banned Huawei from Canada's telecommunications networks and issued a directive to Canada's university granting councils advising banning such partnerships. Joining 4 of our closest intelligence allies who have already banned Huawei or severely restricted Huawei from their network. So our approach would be much more aligned with democratic partners and allies, much more multilateral than the current Trudeau government's approach.
Canada has experienced over the last few years firsthand, in a way that few other countries have experienced, China's so-called hostage diplomacy, with the very prominent case of the 2 Michaels, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. What lessons can be learned from their case, and what more can democracies around the world do together, specifically to prevent this kind of hostage diplomacy?
Well, I think the lesson that can be learned from the wrongful detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor is that we can't give in to hostage diplomacy, that we can't negotiate away on the basis of hostage diplomacy, because that only further emboldens the communist leadership in Beijing to do more of the same. There are over 100 Canadians today that are in detention in China, many of them wrongfully detained. And so there are many cases of citizens that are wrongfully detained in China. And we can't allow China to think that it can not only get away with this, but that there's benefits to them in doing this kind of hostage diplomacy. And so I think that's the one key thing we can learn from this whole experience.
Let me turn to coming back to policies for Hong Kongers, and in particular the lifeboat scheme, which Canada has announced. Other countries like Australia and of course the United Kingdom with its BNO scheme have in different ways offered this lifeline to Hong Kongers. Could you say a bit about specifically what Canada's offer to Hong Kongers is currently, and what, from your perspective in opposition, what more could be done to help Hong Kongers come to Canada?
Well, what the Canadian government has announced is that it's provided a pathway for Hong Kongers fleeing Hong Kong seeking asylum to come to Canada. The challenge with the Trudeau government's approach on this is that in order to do so, they have to obtain documentation from the Hong Kong government of the Special Administrative Region. And for those individuals under suspicion, wrongfully under suspicion because of the draconian national security law, it may not be possible for them to get the appropriate documentation to leave Hong Kong. And so we have been calling on the government to provide a path for alternative documentation that would allow these individuals fleeing Hong Kong to leave Hong Kong without having to notify Hong Kong authorities. It's something that I think the BNO passport initiative allows. The British National Overseas Passport is a document of the UK government. And so it allows those Hong Kongers, millions of them, to get documentation without necessarily alerting Hong Kong authorities. And so I think a similar process like that would address the issue of those who are unable to leave because of a denial of documentation from Hong Kong authorities.
Absolutely. Canada has had a large Hong Kong community for many years, and indeed I was not so long ago in both Toronto and Vancouver and saw parts of the Hong Kong community for myself. What do you think the UK and other countries that are now starting to receive significant numbers of Hong Kongers can learn from Canada about integrating Hong Kongers into a new society, ensuring that they, if they wish to, have a role in public life, but at the same time hold on to their culture and identity as Hong Kongers as well?
Well, I don't think there's a tremendous amount of integration that has to take place because Hong Kongers have grown up with the concepts of the rule of law, with an independent judiciary. Up to this point, they've grown up with a belief in human rights and with elements of democracy. And so, from that point of view, Hong Kongers understand well British democratic institutions and the British way of life. So I see this as an opportunity for both Britons and for Hong Kongers to mutually benefit. Canada has benefited immensely from immigration. We've benefited immensely from the waves of Hong Kongers that have come to Canada for several centuries now. And they've contributed greatly to this country in areas like academia, medicine, business, and just day-to-day life. Throughout Canada, throughout every small town and village throughout this vast land, you could find a Chinese restaurant. Going back as far as 100 years ago, many of these restaurants were started by immigrants from Hong Kong who came over here and made a go of it. Today, their children and grandchildren, lead in many professions, lead in many areas of business. And so I see it as an opportunity for both Britons and Hong Kongers to benefit from this situation.
Absolutely. I know that the issue of questions of Chinese Communist Party infiltration and influence and sometimes intimidation has grown as a concern in both our countries and in other countries. We've had a recent case that's been exposed in the UK. What lessons do you think can be learned from Canada's own situation in this regard? And yeah, what are your reflections on this issue?
Yeah, I think the lesson that should be learned is that governments need to do two things at once, and it's not an easy thing to do. In some ways, it's akin to squaring the circle, but governments need to ensure that we uphold the basic principles that underpin our democracies, belief in free expression, freedom of association, freedom of speech, while at the same time countering some of the subversive and coercive intimidation and influence campaigns being propagated by Beijing in our own country. And so I think that requires a coordinated response from the central government. It requires, the central government to have a focus, a plan with an office, a clearing office for these cases of intimidation and subversion. so that we can counter some of the negative impacts that these intimidation and influence operations are having here on Canadian soil. I think of, for example, what we were subject to in the last election campaign. We lost a number of seats in the last election campaign with significant Chinese communities in this country. The evidence is in that we lost those seats, not because of our policies on the communist leadership in Beijing, but rather because of disinformation that was spread by proxies acting on behalf of Beijing. There was a recent academic paper published by researchers from McGill University that came to that conclusion. And we did not have, we were blissfully unaware that this was taking place. We did not have a robust plan in place to monitor this disinformation that was taking place on Chinese language social media platforms like WeChat, nor did we counter that disinformation. And so, democracies have been slow to respond to disinformation that's coming from authoritarian states or through proxies acting on behalf of authoritarian states. But we're gradually starting to get our act together, and I'm confident that we'll be able to do that going forward, while at the same time respecting the fundamental right of association and freedom of speech.
What are your thoughts on questions around the safety of Hong Kongers coming to Canada and the UK in the face of potential threats from the Chinese Communist Party in our own societies?
Yeah, again, I think we've been slow to react to these intimidation operations, these threats coming from Beijing on our own soil that are particularly targeted toward Chinese communities. And so we've been calling on the Trudeau government to put in place a robust plan, a federal plan, to counter these intimidation operations, a place where people can call in threats that they've received or perceived threats that they've received, and that the federal government would act like a clearinghouse to manage these cases. At the end of the day, in Canada, unlike the United Kingdom, we are a federated state. And so the responsibility for law enforcement goes to the provinces. That said, it's only the national government or federal government that has the national security and intelligence capacity to determine whether or not these threats are coming from Beijing, and to help police forces in that regard. And so that's why we think there should be a stronger federal role in countering these intimidation operations. And at the end of the day, we need to do it. I've heard loud and clear firsthand from Chinese Canadians that they often feel that Ottawa is not there in its authority to protect them here on Canadian soil, and that they fear the impact from Beijing as greater than that of the protection that Ottawa could afford.
It's very interesting. You touched earlier, one of the first questions that I asked, on your emphasis on multilateralism. And I wonder if I can ask specifically about the United Nations and what more could be done at the UN. China has its Universal Periodic Review coming up, I believe, next year. But there are a lot of other UN mechanisms, the Human Rights Council, special rapporteurs, and so on, that perhaps aren't being used as much as they could be. What do you think Canada, working with its allies at the UN, could do to shine a spotlight on Hong Kong in that multilateral forum?
Well, the UN is the only organization we have that includes all countries from around the world. And while it is a deeply flawed organization, it's the only one. And so we have to do our level best to work within the UN structures to advance what we believe to be and fight for what we believe to be right. That said, I think there are other mechanisms through which we can affect outcomes as well. I think about President Biden's proposal for a coalition of democracies, like-minded democracies, to counter some of Beijing's threats to the international rules-based order. I think the unwieldiness of the COP process for climate change demonstrates that getting an agreement with every single nation around the world isn't always the optimal way to achieve outcomes. And so I don't think the UN is the only multilateral way for us to work. I think there's much lower hanging fruit in working through a coalition of democracies rather than through the UN system. That said, if partners like the United States and other permanent members of the UN Security Council, like the United Kingdom, are proposing a certain course of action at the UN or its bodies to advance the cause, then I think Canada should be supportive and work constructively with those like-minded democracies.
Great. A penultimate question. What do you think, and this builds, I guess, on what you've just said, but how do you think the free world can strike the right balance when it comes to the relationship with China in terms of really waking up to the both the dire human rights repression domestically and the increasing aggression of the regime in Beijing abroad, but at the same time signaling that it's the regime in Beijing, not the country or people of China, that we have a problem with. What are your thoughts on how to get that message across effectively?
Well, I think quite simply by doing two things. I think first and foremost, by acknowledging that the Chinese people are part of an ancient civilization that dates back millennia, that have contributed greatly to the progress of humanity, whether it's paper, gunpowder, calligraphy, and so many other things. Chinese civilization has provided much of the advances of humanity, and it's something to be celebrated. We also need to denounce anti-Asian hate and discrimination wherever we see it. People who would use the threats that the communist leadership in Beijing is presenting to us as an excuse for their bigoted and racist views about people of Asian descent. And so I think that's the first thing we need to do. We need to make it clear that our quarrel is not with the Chinese people, and that we have great deal of admiration for the civilization and its contributions to humanity. The second thing we need to do is we need to make clear that our quarrel is with the communist leadership in Beijing and the threats that they are presenting to the rules-based international order, the threats they're presenting to the violation through their violations of international law, through their gross violations of human rights, and there are other belligerents that we've seen in recent years, particularly with some of the things that we've mentioned, such as hostage diplomacy and the like. So I think if we do those two things, I think we can make clear the distinction, and I think that's the path forward. And frankly, I think we have to do both. If we don't denounce anti-Asian hate and discrimination, or if we don't counter the threats to Beijing, we are either going to abandon our fellow citizens of Asian descent who are being targeted because of their race, or we're going to fail to counter the threats, the very real threats that Beijing is presenting to our democracy.
Absolutely. A final question. We are about to celebrate the Lunar New Year, the arrival of the Year of the Tiger. And I wonder if you have, given everything that's happened in Hong Kong specifically in the last few years, if you have a message for people either in Hong Kong or from Hong Kong around the world. I won't put you on the spot and ask you to say it in Cantonese, but what would you say as we mark this Lunar New Year?
Well, the first thing I'll say is Gong Hei Fa Choi to all the people watching from Hong Kong. And what I will also say is that the fight you as Hong Kongers are engaged in is a fight that is worth fighting for, that these principles about a belief in human rights and freedoms, a belief in the rule of law, a belief in democratic institutions are things that people for many centuries have fought for. And the countries that have achieved, the societies that have achieved these outcomes are some of the most prosperous, just, and equitable societies in the history of humanity. And so, history is not always a one step, is not always a unmitigated advancement of progress. Sometimes there are, we go through two steps forward, one step back. And so, I say to Hong Kongers, don't lose hope. Continue to fight for what you are entitled to under international law, and know that there are millions of people around the world who are following things in Hong Kong very closely and who support you.
Well, that's a great message on which to end. Michael Chong, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.